Welcome back, everyone. If folks could please come on in and take your seats or take conversations. Take conversations out in the hall or come on down and sit down. That would be great. So we are shifting gears just a little bit this afternoon. It's time to enter what we've been calling part two, where we really focus on the ecosystem health of the entire Colorado River Basin and other important watersheds around the country. I get to turn things over to our next moderator, Nancy Smith. She's been with the Nature Conservancy for over 20 years. She's also what we like to call a double buff, having earned both her JD and MBA from the University of Colorado. But before I turn things over to her, I really want to mention, you've heard us talk about the vacuum that was created when Doug Kenny retired. In addition to Ann Castle, Nancy Smith really helped out, particularly on the remainder of the day, helping us form, the topics, the speakers, what we wanted to get across the next several hours. So I wanted to thank you very, very much for doing that. I could not have done it without you. So I'll hand it over to you, and thank you to all of our panelists who are joining us for this next panel.
Thank you, Alice. Good afternoon. If you start to feel a little sleepy with the afternoon lull, just feel free to stand up and shake about. I think what Alice said, that we're shifting into part two, but I think one of the exciting things that we as a panel have been able to discuss is actually the continuity with all of the incredible equity and inclusion issues that we discussed in the morning. So that's one of the great things we want to explore, and how that is part of fostering resilience. This panel, we're starting from an assumption that water conservation, water conversations, and in fact, many of those that have been traditionally part of this conference have often focused on addressing the water budget problem, the nuts and bolts of who gets water, how do the states share, and balancing supply and demand, and that often those efforts have left out and not involved all of the right voices in an equitable way that was inclusive. And I think this panel is really saying we have discovered, I think we are really getting it, that is simply not enough. Those conversations, those approaches are absolutely essential, but it is not enough to address the incredible risks that we are facing to our water supply in the Colorado River Basin, especially in the face of the outsized impacts of climate change that we're experiencing. Secretary Vilsack we've all been referencing that. I will note that Brad Udall is going to scare your pants off about this tomorrow at 10 a.m., so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll let him have that privilege. So this panel and my esteemed panelists posit that we must look beyond the water budget problems to focus on broader questions of overall resilience, so that we can sustainably, holistically adapt to and respond to and mitigate the steady and compounding and extreme risks we're facing. And that resilience involves some very nitty-gritty management questions that we'll talk about, but it also involves this concept of cultural resilience, social resilience. As Daryl said, looking to Indigenous peoples who have been sustaining themselves here in a resilient manner for, millennia. So since operational guidelines, drought response plans, DROPA, DRAWA, demand management, water markets, law policy, since all of those things alone are just not going to ensure that our system remains healthy, we want to look at what are the other things we need to be thinking about to face an uncertain climate and drought future. What does resilience mean, really? Lasting, equitable resilience. And this comes to my colleague Phil. And since big resilience questions are inherently expensive, they are more expensive than one-off water budget balancing solutions. Let's build a pipeline. Let's make everyone cut by 20%. They're going to be expensive. And so Phil's going to look at how do we pay for some of these things. Okay, let's dive in here. Again, this is what I'm going to let Brad scare you about tomorrow. Suffice it to say that change is happening fast. The basin is getting hit very hard by climate change. flows have already decreased by 20% compared to the last century, and over half of that is attributable to rising temperatures and climate change. We've got increased forest fires based on climate change impacts. We've got soil moisture deficits. I'm just going to leave it. Trust me, Brad will convince you things are happening fast and we've got to react quickly. So a lot of our conversation today, not all of it, but a lot of it will be based on this report that I want to refer you to this. I want to get that web address up there. This is a fantastic, well-researched report that was authored by Martin and McCoy and Culp and Kelly on behalf of a number of the NGOs in the audience: American Rivers, Environmental Defense Fund, Audubon Society, Nature Conservancy, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, Trout Unlimited, and Western Resource Advocates. A lot of our thinking will be coming from this idea that there are broader strategies we have to be engaging in to really address climate resilience. And then also this key difference that this panel has really realized: we also have to talk about social cultural resilience, and that an equitable watershed is a resilient watershed. So first, I just want to say resilience is a slippery concept. What we mean when we're talking about resilience is the ability of the Colorado River system to absorb change, absorb the incredible change we're facing, respond to it, and adapt in a way that sustains function, that keeps meeting the needs of the people and the natural environment that depends on it. And we're going to look at various ways of cultivating that. This slide is from that 10 strategies report that I showed you. I've put red circles around. You'll notice these are the resilient strategies that fall in that sweet spot. They're emerging. They're not so theoretical that they're perhaps not worth talking about right now. We're going to be talking about forest management, some of these things. And I want to say in addition to those, we are really going to be talking, as I said, about social cultural resilience, resilient decision making. My colleague Kimery Wiltshire is really going to be addressing that. These are the key questions in this report to help define what are the key elements of resilience we should be thinking about in the Colorado River Basin. You'll notice it really talks about climate is front and center. The climate crisis in the Colorado River Basin is a water crisis. There's just no other way of putting it. We are experiencing climate change now in the form of a water scarcity crisis. So you'll notice that that is very integrated into this report. It will be woven throughout our conversation today. And that last bit, which we've added, is to make any of this work, we have got to have resilient decision-making. We've got to have human decision-making systems that are equitable and resilient enough to rise to the challenge as well. We are not going to go in those strategies I highlighted that we're going to talk about, the resilient strategies. I put a circle around what we shorthand call regenerative agriculture, upgrading ag infrastructure. I'm going to say this panel, we are not going to dig deep into this today for a number of reasons, but one of which is that Secretary Vilsack spoke incredibly eloquently to this. I could not in any way speak better than he did about that. So we are going to let his presentation stand for the types of innovative, resilient agricultural strategies that are necessary to create true resilience. The focus on soil health that he talked about, the focus on upgrading infrastructure so that it is more efficient, so that it meets both the needs of our food production needs, but also takes into account the fact that there just isn't going to be as much water to go around. So while this is in that report, I encourage you to dig in deeper. I'll let stand what Secretary Vilsack said. We are going to talk quite a bit about forest management, which the Secretary also mentioned. I cannot emphasize enough that 88% of the water in the Colorado River Basin originates as snow in the headwater forests of Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Our forests are the largest natural reservoir that we have for water. We have got to start thinking about it as much as this basin talks about mead and pal, we should be talking equally, if not more, about our forests. We're going to be talking, two of our panelists, Kimery, Wiltshire, and Phil will be talking a bit about this. And the NGOs that I mentioned that participate in this report, we are looking into some interesting innovations in forest management that not only generate wildfire mitigation benefits, but also have the potential to, in an ecological fashion, increase our forest's ability to hold snowpack, retain snowpack, slow melt. These are very nitty-gritty solutions, but they're part of overall resilience. Natural distributed storage. This is natural infrastructure. Secretary Vilsack used that word. It is more and more becoming part of the parlance that Congress is using when they're thinking about the infrastructure we need in this country. And my colleagues at American Rivers, Mike Fiebig, who will be joining us remotely, will be speaking to some of the solutions that his organization is looking at that takes advantage of process-based restoration, wet meadow restoration, floodplain connectivity, to again create long-term resilience and sustainability in the system that is a necessary counterpart to all of the laws and policies that we're working on. We are going to wrap up. Kimery will be talking about some radical decision-making resilience that her organization, Carpe Diem West, works on. And we'll be wrapping up the panel, our Lyle Balenquah, who is an independent Hopi archaeologist. He will also be talking about this notion of the longevity of the social and cultural resilience that the Hopi people have exhibited and continue to by maintaining their living connection to their water, their rivers, and he'll be talking a bit about this. Okay, so let me see. I think I've got things framed up here. The one last thing I will say is that while we aren't speaking to resilient strategies related to regenerative ag, I just want to note, as an add-on to what Secretary Vilsack said, the fact that our panelists are not speaking to it does not mean we do not recognize the importance. Agriculture uses over, the number varies, but over 70+% of water in the basin. So we fully recognize they have to be part of the solution and part of this broader concept of resilience. But again, we'll let what Secretary Vilsack said stand. And with that, I think I've introduced everyone in the process of talking what we're going to talk about. And oh dear, Kimery, okay, that's okay. Kimery, she's lost in Zoom land somewhere. So I think I'll put you on the spot, Phil. Kimery will come back and she is going to talk about this notion of resilient decision-making and some things that her organization is exploring in the forest management space. But Phil is going to really address this fact of that this is going to be expensive, and we've got to be creative about how to pay for these resilient solutions. So Phil, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Sean, and thanks, Nancy, for introducing me and for the opportunity to present our work at the Blue Forest Conservation to this panel and this audience. I would first off want to start by saying the sessions this morning and the presentations were extremely powerful, and I appreciate all of those. And if you didn't get a chance to see those, I encourage you to go back and watch them again, because they were certainly striking and powerful to me, and I learned a lot this morning. But I'll start off with saying, Blue Forest Conservation is a conservation finance firm. We were founded in 2015, and we're a team of scientists, engineers, and financial experts who, over the past few years, have developed something called the Forest Resilience Bond. And we've been working with the World Resources Institute and the U.S. Forest Service to deploy this. And it's really a public-private partnership that enables private investors to invest in the significant upfront costs of watershed and forest management. and then allows those investors to be paid back over time by the stakeholders who benefit from the implementation of those projects. And when I talk about stakeholders, I'm really talking about federal, state, and local governments and agencies. I'm talking about water and hydroelectric and other utilities. And I'm talking about private companies who are increasingly focused on investing in climate resilience and water replenishment. So why are we even talking about finance in a watershed resilience and equity conference? And really, when we go back and we look at how have we built our society in the past, finance has been one of the main tools that has enabled us to build our infrastructure as we see it today. We use municipal bonds to finance our water and wastewater treatment facilities. We invest in infrastructure that provides power and water. And on a personal basis, we take out mortgages so that we can have a home. We invest in all those things because they'll provide benefits longer than the initial upfront costs. And so it makes sense to pay for them over time because the benefits of that investment also last longer than the upfront costs. And so what we're thinking about is how do we take those same financial tools that have been available for us for built infrastructure and use those to finance natural infrastructure, when we know the benefits of reduced fire risk, protected water supply are going to far outlast the cost and the time to do those restoration treatments. So what we're really trying to do with the Forest Resilience Bond is really enable collaboration around funding. Collaboration is hard. Figuring out how to pay for this is hard. And we're really trying to focus on how do we make it easier so as we finance the large upfront costs, we can start to do this work at a scale that's meaningful. Our initial projects are in the tens of thousands of acres, and that simply isn't going to cut it if we're really going to address climate change, climate resilience, water resilience, and fire resilience. And where this model that I'm going to talk about really works best is where there's multiple benefits to restoration projects. And largely when we think about forest restoration, we're thinking about fire risk reduction to infrastructure and communities, water supply protection and enhancement, and long-term carbon storage and stability. And something I didn't particularly mention there, and something we're going to start to focus on with the California Council on Science and Technology over the next couple of years, is really the impacts of smoke on public health. I didn't mention public health, but this is really a public health crisis. And as you talk about our rural communities, our tribal communities, and our urban communities, they are all being impacted. And those that are disadvantaged are being impacted more because they have less mobility, less ability to get air quality cleaners. And so we're really focusing on what are the costs of that, but ultimately to get to the equity question. And a report came out in California just last year that the fires of 2020 caused an additional 3,000 deaths. In the current pandemic, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it should be shocking on how much impact that is. So when we talk about costs, we're not talking about millions or hundreds of millions. When we talk about public health costs, we're talking in the billions. So I apologize for putting together a flow chart, and this might be one of the only ones you see today, but we'll get through it together, and I just wanted to show how this works at a high level. So when we know that there's a restoration project that's been planned and permitted, and it's going to cost a certain amount of money, what Blue Forest does is it brings in investors to fund all the upfront costs through a forest resilience bond that's specific to that restoration project. We pass that money along to what we call our implementation partners. Blue Forest doesn't do the project on the ground. We work with nonprofit organizations to do that. And in our first project, that was the National Forest Foundation on the Tahoe National Forest, but that could be tribes, that could be conservation districts, counties, National Wild Turkey Federation, anyone whom the Forest Service has a collaborative agreement with to work on a project and work on their land. As our implementation partners implement those restoration activities and some of those benefits that I talked about before accrue to the stakeholders, we've contracted with those beneficiaries to pay over time back into the Forest Resilience Bond, and we pass that money back to investors with a small amount of interest. Now, if there's something I've learned about conversations in Colorado over the past few years, It's Coloradoans don't particularly like to be told what California is doing and how Californians do things. And that is not what is happening here today. It just happened to be the first region where our pilot is in the Tahoe National Forest. And so that smaller map on the upper left, the red outline, is a 15,000 acre pilot Yuba project. This is in the headwaters of the North Yuba River, the ancestral homelands of the Mountain Maidu and Nisenan tribes. And what we worked to understand was, if we implement this project as a pilot, how do we expand it to the entire 275,000 acre watershed? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Most of this work is thinning and prescribed burning to reduce fire and restore resilience and ecological health to the forest. But it also includes things like aspen regeneration, removing invasive plants, meadow restoration. So we're looking to attain full ecological restoration with these projects, not just things that create economic benefit. So we sat down with the Yuba Water Agency in the state of California and said, there's this unfunded project. What are all the benefits of this project, and why would you be interested in funding it? The Yuba Water Agency manages a 1 million acre foot reservoir at the bottom of the at the bottom of the watershed. And they are a flood control agency, a water supplier to 8 agricultural irrigation districts, and they produce hydropower. So anything that happens in this upper watershed, 75% of which the Tahoe National Forest manages, is going to severely affect them. And working with the World Resources Institute, we understood that between fire risk and water supply, the project would benefit them about $8.8 million. And the project costs were only about $4 million, giving an ROI of 2 to 1. So there's a strong economic, in addition to the ecological interest, to do this project. And we get to work with a lot of great people at the Forest Service, and Lon is one of the best. And what he's really saying here is, had we gone through the traditional timeline of Forest Service implementation, where they would typically put out a timber sale, get any receipts if there were any, and get a dribble of congressional appropriations for this work, it would have taken in excess of 10 years to implement just this one project. We've been able to flip that on its head and get it done in 3 to 4 years. It says 3, we're in the 3rd year now. It'll honestly go into the next field season because it's been a bit challenging to put fire on the ground over the past few years. So to kind of bring this back to Colorado, and why this is an example of Colorado, is really about scale. We have large landscape management issues that we need to address all over the West. And where we started with an initial $4 million forest resilience bond pilot on 15,000 acres, a year later, 9 organizations came together, large and small governments, large and small NGOs, including the Nature Conservancy, and tribes, to really understand how do we plan and implement restoration over this entire 275,000 acre watershed. And so we'll be launching our next forest resilience bond, about $25 million, to do in excess of 40,000 acres at the bottom of this watershed, hopefully next month. And then the notice of intent for the NEPA for the entire watershed has been released in the past couple of weeks. So this is really how we're looking to get to scale and do the entire $80 to $100 million investment required for this landscape. And I'll leave it there, but thank you, and thanks again, Nancy, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Phil. Okay, good news. We have tracked down Kimery. I want to remind everyone, I've been encouraged not to read full bios because they are available in the program. So please do check that out for the illustrious, experience of all our panelists. But in brief, I'll say Kimery is with Carpe Diem. And as I noted, she's going to talk about some of the really deep collaboration that her organization is exploring in the forest management space. And, part of what this panel is positing, that decision-making resilience is also part of the big picture solutions we have to explore. Okay, Kimery, are you in Zoom land somewhere?
I am in Zoom land.
Great. Well, I think our technical whizzes are trying to figure out how to get you on the screen.
Okay. There we go. Start my video. That's what it says.
Excellent.
Now
And
I know I have to go and find the video.
So Kimery, are you prepared to run the slideshow from your computer there? Can you go in presentation mode?
I am.
Okay.
I am prepared. There we go. Zoom says I can't start share screen while the other participant is sharing. So whoever is still sharing, knock it off. Nope. All right. In that case, I'm just going to go ahead and start. And Sean or one of his wizard IT colleagues will go and pull up my slideshow, which are just a few slides.
Sean,
So,
can we pull it up from the computer here or? Okay, he says you should now be able to share.
okay, let's see here what we can do.
The bold new world of.
It is totally a bold new world. Well, it's not coming up, Sean. So take it away, and I will just go ahead and start. Hi, everyone. Greetings from the San Francisco Bay Area, where the skies are blue, blessedly. There is no wildfire smoke up there in the sky, which is an increasingly unusual sky for us to have. We've had a lot of wildfire smoke, as has most of the West this year and last year. So I'm going to talk about healthy forests, healthy water, and healthy people. As we think about water in the Colorado Basin and sort of water throughout the American West, so all of us tree-hugging white people are learning that resilience is much more than ecosystem health. It's also about human health and human culture and human lives. And I want to emphasize that last one Phil brought up about public health. This is a public health emergency. And I couldn't agree more. And if we've learned anything about climate change so far, it's that we are all in this boat together. There is no escaping that. So Nancy mentioned, let's go to the Colorado Basin. Nancy mentioned that about 85% of the water in the Colorado main stem comes off of.
And Kimery, I'm just going to interrupt for one second. We do have your slideshow now, so if you let us know. Good. Okay, good.
Could you change the slide, please? Next slide. Okay, there we go. Well, that one's jumping ahead, but that's quite all right. As Nancy mentioned, the source of about 85% of the water in the main stem of the Colorado comes off of less than 12% of the land mass. So these are high elevation forests in the upper basin, almost exclusively national forest land. And overall, we see in the American West that about 60% of water supply in the American West is also sourced on national forest lands. And as you know, these lands are burning. So over the past 15 years at Confluence West, which some of you know as Carpe Diem West, working on climate change in Western water, we found 3 ingredients that are essential to scaling up forest and water health projects. So here they are: partnership, allyship, Vuca, and of course, if we're talking about Vuca, we got to talk about beavers as well. So there will be a nod to beavers at the end of this. So each of these examples that I'm touching on come from out of the basin, but it's work that can be applied anywhere. And it is, I want to emphasize, it's what's working, even in the face of climate change, even in the face of, all the horrendous economic challenges, et cetera. So let's start with partnerships. Next slide, please. So this is French Meadows, and French Meadows, we're going to talk about partnerships. French Meadows is upper watershed in the middle fork of the American River in the Tahoe National Forest in the Sierra Nevada. So we think about partnerships as sort of being the next evolutionary step forward from collaboration. So partnerships means that, so everyone who has skin in the game is at the table, but they're also all bought into the end game. And obviously it can take some time to get to that agreement, but they're all brought into that end game, and they all have equal say regardless of their institutional power. So this is, as you know, wildfires just keep ripping through the Sierra Nevada as they're whipping through so many forested systems in the American West and in Canada. So, and the Sierra Nevada is also another one of those places that's a source of about 60% of the water supply in California. So in the face of all these devastating wildfires, the French Meadows Partnership was formed to develop, manage, and implement resilience work in this watershed. So participants include the Regional Water Agency, local businesses, the county, the key state agency, the Nature Conservancy, a university research institute, the local land trust, and of course the Forest Service. So this is a 28,000 acre forest restoration project. And it is all about not just improving the health of the municipal watershed and the water that flows downstream, but the partnership has also pioneered ways to accelerate the pace and scale of forest restoration. And, Phil referred to this with the quote from the gentleman who's the district ranger about the North Yuba project. But in this case, thanks to everyone agreeing to sort of row in the same direction, the partnership it significantly decreased the typical amount of time to do all of the studies and the permitting from about 4 years to about 18 months. And together, this partnership has raised the $17 million needed to do the work. Next slide, please. So the next ingredient to success is allyship. And as you see here, this is a map of the Upper Rio Grande in New Mexico. So historically, the folks that have lived in the Upper Rio Grande for quite a few decades and centuries, the land-based communities and the pueblos have had a rocky relationship with the Forest Service. Any forest health work or traditional uses of wood done by these communities was usually ignored in favor of, say, out-of-state contractors coming in and doing the work, or not considered eligible for treatment funding, or the Forest Service just shut them down. So these upper basin forests are the source of most of the important tributaries in the Rio Grande, and these watersheds, no surprise, keep burning. So that means downstream water supply and quality for Santa Fe, for Albuquerque, for the pueblos, for agriculture, and for ecosystems takes a big hit. So 7 or so years ago, the folks that started the Rio Grande Water Fund recognized that both the participation and, equally important, the knowledge of these land-based communities and pueblos was essential to the success of any partnership to protect New Mexico's forests and waters. So the fund is a collection of allies, and thanks to that founding commitment of allyship, over the past years, the fund has collectively raised $3.4 million in private funding, which in turn has helped leverage $49 million in public funding. About 140,000 acres have been treated so far. They've supported about 1,400 community forest jobs, and they have about 330,000 acres in the planning pipeline. Next slide, please. Okay, so the third, we're going to talk about planning for Vuca. And if you don't know this catchy little acronym, it's one you can you can now adopt. So you can think of Vuca as the 4 horsemen of climate change. So this is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So those of you who are familiar with the Salt Lake region know that most of the water supply comes off of Forest Service lands in the Wasatch. And currently about 1.7 million people live in the region, and the population is projected to increase 35% by 2065. So there's 2 really big, gnarly challenges to keeping a water supply quality and quantity flowing. So the first is that these mountains and their rivers and watersheds are just being loved to death. In 2019, the National Forest recorded 11.3 million visitors, and that's up 31% in the past 10 years. The second, and of course, primary concern is the fact, though, that The Wasatch aren't high elevation. It's not a high elevation mountain range, unlike the Rockies or even the Sierra Nevada or even parts of the Cascades. So as a result, as temperatures continue to warm, snowmelt runoff becomes flashier, and we're obviously going to most likely see less precipitation as in the decades ahead. So in the face of all of that, how do you prepare for Vuca, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity? So in 2019, the Salt Lake Public Utilities completed a 60-year supply and demand master plan to accelerate actions that promote resiliency. And so these include everything from expanding their 110-year-old partnership with the Forest Service to protect and restore these watersheds. And from that to working with people of color communities to ensure that water rates don't become unaffordable for them. Next slide. So no conversation about forest and watershed resilience would be complete without a nod to the Western beavers. This is a picture taken just a few weeks ago, deep in the heart of the Cameron Peak 2020 wildfire. And as you can see, looks pretty darn nice down below where that nice little beaver house is down there. And then up above, it's just kind of torched. So next slide, please. So finally, I will say that, these are grim times for our planet. But to very badly paraphrase Edward Abbey, with apologies, as we think about, that we do all we can do right now, we can do everything that we can do to heal and restore our home and our planet. Don't forget the joy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kimery. We'll have a chance for some questions. Our colleague, Mike Fiebig, was going to be here in person, but unfortunately his flight was canceled last night. So hopefully, so he is joining us from Zoom land. And Mike, as I said, he is the director of the Southwest River Protection Program with American Rivers. And the panel thought it would be great to explore, aspects of resilience that are related to the necessity for a truly resilient system to have a mosaic of different management types. It's not enough to have a fully managed system, that there needs to be a diversity of land use types and management strategies and designations to create a system that's resilient, and I'd say communities that is resilient in the long term. Mike's going to talk a bit about that, as well as some natural distributed storage benefits from that approach. And there you go, Mike, turn it over to you. And Mike, can you run your slideshow through Zoom, or would you like us to run it from here?
I can, thanks, Nancy. I can do it through Zoom if that's preferable.
Great.
Or at least, let's see if I can. Maybe.
If needed, Sean is doing a great job here of running it from here if you need, so just let us know.
All right, I'm going to be able to do it. Okay, are you seeing that, Nancy?
Yes.
All right, great, thanks. And thanks, everyone. I wish I could be there in person with you all, though this gives me a chance, since it was packed anyways, to wear a button-down shirt and a coat in the privacy of my own home by myself. so here I am presenting to you remotely. Yeah, hi, I'm from American Rivers, and I'm based down in Durango, Colorado, where we're currently getting a much needed thunderstorm, and happy to present to you on a few things. Basically talking about the role that river protection and natural distributed storage, natural infrastructure play in building resilience. As Nancy said, we talk a lot about the more hard infrastructure that we have great control over, and we're advocating for a patchwork approach to this that includes a balanced distributed storage portfolio and river protection portfolio. So I don't need to wax on too longly on this with this group, but intact river systems and riparian zones and watersheds give us a lot of ecological benefits, from clean drinking water to wildlife habitat, migration corridors, climate refugia, and places of cultural and sacred significance as well. Though riparian zones are less than 1% of our lands in the West, they're the most fecund of our lands, and they're essential for a number of our species. I could have put a lot of different slides in this one, but this is a gray infrastructure slide. This is a representation of the 90,000 dams that we have across the United States, according to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I wanted to put this up here, and it could just as easily have been a number of different footprints of development to make that case that we have a lot of gray infrastructure, and it gives us a lot of benefits, from irrigation water to food production year round to, energy to heat our homes, transportation grids and places to live. Some friends up at Headwaters Economics once did an infographic for us for lands in rivers in Montana, mapped only by their development, no other lines on the map. And you could see almost every river in Montana, except for the large protected areas, just by the development footprint. We love our corridors, our river corridors. At the same time, we've got to realize that there are major trade-offs to this. And these are lesion. We've talked a lot about the water quantity trade-offs in the Southwest, in the Colorado ecosystem. We also are in an extinction crisis. 83%, upwards of 80% of freshwater dependent species, including mammals, fish, birds, and aquatic species that are essentially tied to freshwater systems, are in danger of extinction. So there's a trade-off for this, but there is a balance in the making. So I could have put a few different slides here too, and this one has some limitations. These were the maps that I have on hand, but the map on the left that you see is a map of the nationwide rivers inventory. It's maintained by the National Park Service, and it's an inventory of rivers that the Park Service has found to be free flowing and have at least one outstanding value. And then, of course, the map on the right is designated wild and scenic rivers. And you can see a large difference between the two. Not shown on the map on the left are all of the thousands of rivers that are free flowing and intact and have outstanding values that agencies like the BLM, the US Forest Service, and US Fish and Wildlife Service have found in their own inventories. So a note for myself in the future is to hire a cartographer to dig into and make a combined map that would show all of those. We're used to looking at this Colorado River Basin map quite frequently. It shows not only the upper and lower basin, but it shows areas where the Colorado River has been diverted and is being used outside of the basin in a trans-basin fashion. I'd love us also to get used to looking at the the Colorado River Basin in ways like this. Places that either have ongoing protection or have either cultural or ecological values worth protecting. And there are tons of them. There are dozens and dozens of intact, free-flowing rivers with high ecosystem values and climate refugia, carbon mitigation, and cultural significance. And I should note, since we are talking about climate change as an overlay with this conference, as well as equity, that we've found very few carbon sequestration mechanisms better than intact watersheds. They do their work for free, and they do it without operation and maintenance costs once we get them back into functioning systems. So these are lists of either projects that are ongoing, focal areas, or areas that have been identified by partners as places we can do a lot of work. At the same time, we're going through a planning process bubble right now in the Southwest that, in fact, American Rivers and partners across the 4 states are involved in anywhere from 12 to 14 different forest management plan revisions, or BLM, resource management plan revisions. Together, these planning efforts offer a once-in-a-generation opportunity to engage in ecosystem resilience, cultural resilience, and protection and restoration of habitat. And they also have the benefit of being largely located in intact headwater systems that have a high predictive, are predicted to persist as climate refugia and provide clean, cool water in the face of climate change too. Bringing it back to our own Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, this is their BRAT tool, their Beaver Restoration Assessment tool. And as you can see from the lit up screenshot there, it's legion, as a couple of our panelists have noted, and Kimery most recently, beavers also are great ecosystem engineers, and again, they're unpaid. They do their work for free, and they do it in perpetuity if we give them the ability to do so. So with river, I think we can think of the resilience piece from intact ecosystems in 2 ways: protecting those ecosystems that are intact and restoring those ecosystems that aren't, and then making sure that is a balance to the gray infrastructure that we have. And then finally, it goes without saying, it's been mentioned already, that good ecological protection and restoration comes from, at least if it's going to be durable over time, comes from good cultural and equity work and collaboration. We have a huge opportunity to not only right past wrongs, but engage those who have deep knowledge and ties to our ecosystems through funding, access, collaboration, technical assistance, and a number of other ways to get a lot of this work done. And I will stop there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Okay, we have one last panelist, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. Lyle Balenquah is joining us remotely as well. We are going to run his slideshow from here. And he is a Hopi archaeologist. He'll speak to us about the living connections that the Hopi people maintain to their rivers, in a true statement of longevity and ultimate resilience.
Good afternoon, everybody. I assume you can hear me. Thumbs up.
Good, Lyle.
Okay. Thanks for having me be a part of this panel. My name is Lyle Balenquah. I am a member of the 3rd Mesa Greasewood clan from the village of Volatility, member of the Hopi tribe, which is in northeastern Arizona. Most of my work is involved in the area of archaeology. I've been an archaeologist for 20-something years now, and part of the work has also been as a river guide and backpacking guide across the Southwest. So when I was asked to participate in this panel, I was a little bit uncertain as to what my role would be. And kind of at the last moment, we were able to figure it out. The slides that are up are really just for, kind of pretty pictures and to help guide me in terms of what I want to talk about. Ironically, we're talking about watersheds in this panel for the most part in this conference. And, where I'm at in the village or on the Hopi Mesas, we are landlocked, meaning that, we have no perennial sources of water here on the reservation, even though much of our ancestral lands, included areas like the photo you're seeing right now, which is the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River down in the Grand Canyon. And this is a really culturally significant area, not just for Hopi people, but for many tribes here in the Southwest. We all have some kind of connection to this landscape. And so I thought this would be a good starting point in terms of how I, as an archaeologist, work within my community to talk about water usage, not just in our ancestral past, but how, we take those lessons and apply them to today. And so the first part of this real quick talk, I'm going to focus on the trips that Hopi does down in the Grand Canyon. Go to the next slide, please. Hopi, through our Cultural Preservation Office, is allowed, kind of ironic, is allowed one trip per year. We have a permit to take Hopi tribal members down into the Grand Canyon. Mostly all males. There's culturally traditions associated with that. I don't need to go into there. And again, I'm going to have to gloss over a whole lot. And so unfortunately, if you have more questions, we can get to that, or I can provide you references later on. But through these trips, we're able to go down and take members of the Hopi community to visit ancestral sites along the Colorado River and really get an understanding of how these watersheds, not only what role they played in our ancestral past, but also how they remain, culturally viable to us today in the modern day. They're not just, when you look on the map, the 1.6 million acres of the Hopi Reservation is a political boundary that was not established by us as Hopi people. And so these trips are really important in providing these individuals a greater understanding of what, ancestral lands really means, what that concept entails. And what that means is that, we're taking that political boundary and wiping it off the map. And we're demonstrating that our knowledge, our traditional knowledge and know-how extends well beyond those boundaries. And so it's through these trips that we are able to really get into some of the detailed history of who we are, where we come from. But what are those lessons that we've learned, as people? Nowadays, we're landlocked here on the Meadows. We don't have any large-scale irrigation for our farming activities. We are probably some of the best dry farmers in the world, being able to cultivate corn, beans, squash, and other crops through just the moisture that comes through monsoon rains and the winter snowpack. And so where do we gain that knowledge from? And what is the value of water and moisture here in the Southwest? So, coming from this dry area to a river like the Colorado River, stark contrast in terms of what is available, but yet what are the lessons that we've learned? Let's go to the next slide, please. Is everybody there?
We can hear you, Lyle.
Okay. I think the next slide was another. I'll just keep talking about the Hopi, connection in terms of what we do on these river trips. And so another tangent from these trips is not just to visit. There we go. Our ancestral past. Here's a group of Hopi gentlemen at the Nankoweap granaries in the upper stretch of the Grand Canyon. But again, we're talking about what are those lessons that we've learned. That a big question a lot of people will ask is, in ancestral times, we did occupy many well-watered regions with lakes, with rivers. It's green. Why did we ultimately choose to leave those well-watered areas and come to, a very high dry desert area. And part of the teaching is that because it was to give us or grant us the ability to be humble in our nature in terms of how we live our lifestyle, being very efficient in our living conditions. And so that relates back to this idea of how do you value water? I have, very vivid stories from my grandparents about their parents having to visit springs as their only viable water source. And sometimes springs were just a small trickle or a small drop coming out, and they would have to play their, ceramic pot there and maybe wait for hours. The ladies would wait all day, to access whatever water they needed for the day, and then, take that back home. And that has to be reserved, and used very sparingly. So these are those kind of teachings that we still, when we look at the larger scope of how water in the West is being used, we really have to scratch our heads and wonder, why aren't some of these kind of water efficient methods, why aren't we looking at water as a more valuable resource? We take it for granted that we can turn on the faucet. Even here at Hopi, most of the communities, most of the villages have running water, have access to infrastructure. Some don't, some by choice, but still we retain these teachings about how water is a valuable resource and not to be misused, not to be disrespected. So how does that, translate to our modern day and how we're advocating for, greater access to water? Next slide, please. It should say, I'm just an archaeologist. I'm not a lawyer or a politician. I'm not, throwing shade to anybody who is one or is seems to be one. My experience is really based in the photos that I'm showing you. This really kind of land-based experience and actually getting out there, not just with my fellow archaeologists, but like this photo, just getting out there with other tribal members. So this is a photo from a river trip down Grand Canyon in which we brought members, various tribal members from the 11 affiliated tribes that are affiliated to the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. And we were able to spend time down there and really have these deep discussions about our own individual tribal cultural connections to the landscape, to water. What is the message that we would like to convey out to the larger world in terms of, sometimes maybe even in this day, tribal communities are looked at or viewed as being primitive, because we don't readily accept sometimes some of the modern technology that is available out there. And again, a lot of that is rooted, based in our historic and ancestral past of how we've been able to survive in a dry environment for so long. We've been able to not just survive, but flourish. You can look at archaeological sites across the Southwest and you see what those folks, my ancestors, were able to do. They were able to create great architecture, really beautiful pieces of art. And what that tells you is that they weren't all just living hand to mouth. It's that they were able to live mostly, in some harmony with their landscape. So it's experiences like these that really allow us and give us that opportunity to share our own stories, but also our concerns about how, we address the water issue here. Next slide, please. This is another, culturally important river. This is the San Juan River in southeastern Utah. It's known as Yotse in Hopi language, which translates to the Ute River, which is a homage to Ute people who some historians will say they are newcomers to that area. But Hopi history has always stated that we have lived side by side with Ute ancestors, well before recorded history. And so this is one of those rivers that we also journey down. We talk a lot about. It's a culturally important river to us here at Hopi, even though it's 200 miles north of us. Next slide, please, and get through this real quick. I had to pay homage to my river guiding community out there. I threw this photo in because there's more than just access to the water for our municipalities, for our daily usage. We also have these issues of how we continue that access and remain in the public eye. And And so some of us work as river guides. And I wanted to include this photo because 4 of the 5 guides pictured in this photo are indigenous. There's myself and 3 Navajo guides there. So we are out there. We use this as a way not only to remain connected to these landscapes, but also be able to educate, the folks out there, the public, the guests that we bring down the river, and give them this education about not only our ancestral and historical ties to these landscapes, but again, what are those issues and concerns that we have that perhaps we can help educate them about. Oftentimes we gain allies and advocates through this method, through being able to share quality time with them on rivers across the Southwest so that they have a better education of the lack of water infrastructure, the lack of water access that indigenous communities continue to face to this day. And so, a nod to all the indigenous guides, working out there on the landscape in our own ancestral lands. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one. Okay, most of our time is spent on the landscape is in part dealing with, educating the outside world, the public out there, the general public. Again, a lot of these activities have to be refocused back to our own communities. And this is where I've really been fortunate to be able to engage multiple tribal members, not just from my own communities, but across, different tribes out there, not just here in the Southwest, but across the United States. And so I threw this in there because it's important. We're planning for the future. We're always looking ahead. In Hopi, we're always thinking about, however many generations forward. And so this photo is talking about that combination of the ancestral past, bringing that forward, but also teaching it to our younger generations, to our current generations, so that they become and remember, this stewardship values that we retain that are associated not just with rivers and watersheds, but with the landscape in general. And so it's really important that as we discuss policies and the legalities of how water is going to be used and managed, that we're thinking about these future generations and how, as indigenous people, we are continually fighting for that access, for the right to have uses of that water. Ironically, here on the Hopi Reservation, even though both the San Juan River and the Colorado River are considered part of our ancestral lands, we have no water rights associated with either of those rivers. So we are effectively cut off from sources of water that our ancestors used for thousands of years. And those are the things that myself and others here on Hopi, these are the issues that we are dealing with. We're continually advocating and trying to educate the larger world out there about, how can we continue to be resilient indigenous communities? What do we need to be able to be self-sufficient? We don't want to rely on handouts. We don't want to rely on the outside world. We want to be these self-sufficient people that we have been for thousands of years. And so really my involvement in these water issues and land-based issues is really talking about increasing, that usage and access to these resources. And I will end it there. So thank you again for the opportunity to present and talk to you all.
Excellent. Thank you, Lyle. All right, those are our formal presentations. Alice, given that we're off schedule, I have no way of gauging. Do we have time for a few panel questions or?
Yeah, why don't we
Great. Yeah. Okay.
make a little more?
Okay.
Depends on our next panel.
Excellent. Okay, this gentleman here.
Okay, thank you. The headline for these 2 sessions was Ecosystem Health in the Colorado River. And Phil, you mentioned ecosystem health in your talk. Could you go define ecosystem health, please?
A good question. We actually don't define ecosystem health at Blue Forest. So we let the local land managers, tribes, other stakeholders plan what they think ecosystem health is, because we're not the ones that are coming in and saying, this is what ecosystem health should be, or ecological resilience. So we're really looking to the local communities to plan and permit those projects. And part of the reason is a governance issue. So we represent investors, paying stakeholders. And so there's been concerns in the past that that might pervert what happens on the landscape for resilience. And so we want to avoid even the perception that that would be the case, even if we're not, objectively trying to do that. So we're, so from an ecosystem restoration and ecosystem resilience standpoint, we're weirdly enough, Blue Forest Conversation is actually out of what that actually means from a planning process. Now, what I'll say personally, as a forest hydrologist and a watershed hydrologist in the past, the three main disturbances on this landscape are wildfire, climate change, and people, right? And so when you talk about resilience, it's really about how are you creating the ecological resilience to allow people to continue to thrive, right? And the systems in place. And so we call it restoring ecological function. So how are these places self-sustaining again? How can they accept fire in a low to moderate severity again? So it's really about restoring those ecological processes. And you heard that a little bit with the talk about low-tech process-based restoration for rivers and beavers. These are things that can, if you set up the process, it will actually continue in perpetuity and won't necessarily need a whole lot of operations and maintenance going forward. Not always going to be the case with our forests and trying to, reinvigorate a lot of the cultural burning that used to happen on them and the caretaking that used to happen. But in some of these processes, that's really what we're looking to do is really make them so that they can take care of themselves again, as was said earlier.
And I might just add to that, that is part of what I was talking about in terms of defining resilience. A resilient system is one that has ecological health, and at the Nature Conservancy, first and foremost is relying on science to define that, as well as the local community's desires. But the notion that a resilient system, a healthy functioning ecological system has the ability to absorb change, adapt to it while continuing to perform the ecosystem functions, to still provide clean water, to provide clean air and deal with small forest fire disturbances without it turning into these huge catastrophic wildfires. So I think ecosystem health and resilience are completely connected. David.
Phil, I didn't quite understand the financial model. I know you didn't want to go too deeply into it, but what is the revenue source to pay these bonds? And what kind of return? Is this a below market return for these bondholders? And are they doing this out of social conscience, or what drives the bondholders?
Sure, it's a great question. And I kind of skipped lightly through the finance portion of the talk, but so the Yuba Water Agency funded $1.5 million of the $4 million project over 5 years, $300,000 a year. The state of California put in $2.85 million through a reimbursable grant. And so the private investors that we got to fund the upfront $4 million were repaid through the Yuba Water Agency and the state of California contributions. The investors that we look for these projects and that are interested, there's really kind of two kinds. There's the philanthropic community who invest through what's called program-related investments or below market rate investments. And then there's the market rate community, and that includes impact investors, but we also had an insurance company in our first project interested in reducing the risk of fire to their assets and their insured assets, which, through a property and casualty company that were hit pretty hard by the 2017 wine country fires in California. So they recognized the need to invest in this work. And so the blended finance rate for the first project was about 2.5%, 1% for the PRIs, and about 4% for the market rate. It'll be about the same this time just because there's going to be more market rate, but the market rate's actually a little less because of where insurance or interest rates are now. They'll be about 3.5%, and the PRIs are about 0.5%.
Anne.
Phil, I have a related question for you. I'm wondering how you value the benefits of these investments in order to evaluate that financial transaction. And I'm particularly interested if you've been able to quantify the value of forest restoration to water supply.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the first project, and probably for much of the projects, when you think about costs, about 80% of the costs, avoided costs of doing restoration work are going to be around wildfire suppression and post-wildfire rehabilitation, which includes some of the water quality issues we'd see in our source water. And so about 20% in this first project actually came from what we anticipate for water supply enhancement. Now, this is one of the areas in the Sierra Nevada that rains and snows more than anywhere else. So as you had a lack of fire suppression and a lot more vegetation has grown up, it actually soaks up a lot more water. And so as we're starting to pull that vegetation back, because it's not a water limited system, we'll actually see more water in our streams and reservoirs. I want to be careful though, it's not necessarily the case here in Colorado. If it does happen, it may be a little bit more transient or maybe not quite as substantial. So I just want to be careful around that. And then the other piece with the wildfire is how much water related infrastructure is in the watershed. In that Yuba example, there's no actual infrastructure, but if you move just a little further south, just north of the Caldor fire in the El Dorado National Forest, there's a series of 7 hydropower facilities from the crest of the Sierra down to the town of Sacramento. And so you can imagine the amount of built infrastructure that would be impacted by any fire that would occur in that area. So it really is a place-to-place assessment.
And along those lines, I might note that Denver Water, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, a lot of how they calculated avoided costs in their Forest to Faucets program was they looked at the damage from the Hayman fire to their infrastructure and delivery systems, and they estimated it around $70 million. And so that has driven their then calculation of how much they want to invest in proactive management.
I think, I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Wrap it up. So big thanks to our Kimery, Mike, Lyle, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. Bill, thanks for joining us. I'll invite down our next set of panelists and continue the conversation.